It had been 3 days since he had arrived here. In 5 days, the negotiations would happen, and the humans would have to be dealt with. Tricurius's mind was constantly occupied with thinking of how humans would react to his proposals and ideas. He himself was tasked by his liege to ensure 2 things. The first was figuring out their intentions and ensuring they wouldn't be another enemy of the Imperium. The Imperium was already fighting enemies on all fronts: Emini from the northeast, dwarves from the northwest, the Arismer from the sea, the Surai and Kot from the south, and the Orcs from the east. The second was to kickstart trade and diplomatic relations with the humans. The Imperium didn't have the resources and troops to start a war with another faction, and as such, trade and peace was preferable. Tricurius himself, however, wanted to realize a third thing: to not just create truce, but a lasting peace. War with the humans would be devastating for the Imperium. The humans possessed the logistics and technologies to destroy even the most fortified cities within hours. Such a war wouldn't bring wealth and slaves, but rather destruction and sorrow. According to his watch, it was 3:19. He still had to write several letters to his liege, informing him of his findings and what he advised him to do. One thing was constantly in the back of his mind: when would the Orcs arrive? That could certainly change quite a few things. If he knew when they would arrive, he could inform the humans. Seeing such a brash display of violence, the humans would surely condemn the Orcs, giving him an advantage in the negotiations. Just when he was finished writing his letters and giving them to one of his couriers, a loud sound blared through the room. Red flashes of light came from a device on the ceiling. Tricurius covered his ears, yet the sound was still hearable. All combat personnel report to battle stations immediately. Non-combatants go to your quarters and remain there until further instructions. A loud, robotic voice came from the device on the ceiling. To battle stations? They were under attack. This, of course, could be some regular bandits. However, it could also be the Orcs. Tricurius grinned. There was danger. There was, however, also an opportunity. Considering the humans' technology and magicless magic, which might or might not be the same thing, he was quite certain these humans were perfectly capable of defending themselves. That would be something he wouldn't have to worry about. So, off he went. Fate favors the bold, after all. When he reached the exit to the castle, 2 heavily clad soldiers stood guarding it. He approached the men. "Guests are supposed to be in their quarters, sir." One of them firmly and yet politely said, "I have crucial information about the horde that is approaching the castle. They're Orcs, not here to attack. Bringing troops to a diplomatic meeting is a strange tradition of theirs." Tricurius said, "Listen. I am aware that if the Orcs continue to advance, they'd get grinded into the dirt. I'm doing this so that nobody dies." That was a complete lie. He was doing this so that he could be seen as a hero, thus gaining him some respect from the humans. "Fine then. Go in, but we'll be keeping a close eye on you," the same guard said. He trudged through the courtyard with his knights following him closely when he finally arrived at the castle's walls. There, he saw hundreds of figures clad in suits of armor gripping their magical sticks they called plasma rifles. In the distance, he could make out 3 Orcish hosts, each one following each other in what almost seemed like a competition of who could reach the castle the fastest. The sun shone brightly today, and the light was reflected on the well-disciplined warriors of the Orcish host's armor and shields. The Orcs appeared to be disciplined enough to not tramp through the fields of crops, and instead followed the wide road out of the forest towards the castle. What he assumed to be an officer immediately ran up to him. "All guests are to be in their rooms, sir." He politely said, "I am aware. I, however, have some rather crucial about the encroaching Orcish hosts." Tricurius said, "Trust me. If I thought they'd pose any danger, I would have fled by now. The officer nodded. I have no idea how you got past military police, but go speak to Colonel Romano. He's the one standing up without a rifle. The officer pointed to the colonel, and Tricurius immediately walked up to him. A thought creeped into his mind. While walking, Romano sounded like an imperial name. He even knew a lad by the name of Romano. Then again, maybe it had a completely different meaning in the human language. What is a diplomat doing here? The colonel yelled out as he removed his helmet. One thing that Tricurius noticed was that none of these humans looked any day past their prime. Elves were the longest-lived species, with a grand 300 years. Then came the dwarves with 200 years, the Emini and orcs would be lucky if they lived for 100 years, and the beast folk usually only reached 40 or 50, although the fact that most of them were killed as soon as they couldn't work anymore certainly played a part in that. The colonel, which Tricurius assumed to be an elderly and high-ranking man, looked no older than Carlson or the cooks he had met. Maybe it was another human technology. The colonel had a slightly tanned skin and hazel-brown eyes. He sported a rather fabulous mustache and had blackish hair. Tricurius had spent enough time thinking, though. He had to respond. Tricurius stood up and pointed towards the orcish hosts. These hordes, they come in peace, bringing soldiers with them as gifts and guards, not soldiers to conquer or kill. Tricurius said, Their warmongering culture demands that they do this. I advise you to talk to them before you understandably mow them all down. The colonel looked towards Tricurius and then towards the soldiers. Don't worry. They'll only fire if I command them to do so. He cleared his throat and put on his helmet. He touched a few buttons on his helmet, and Tricurius could make out that Romano was speaking. He put off his helmet and pressed a strange iron thing in his ear. The diplomat is coming. You can explain to her how we're supposed to make contact to thousands of medieval LARPers. Tricurius didn't know what that last part meant. However, he did know that he had to come up with a plan of action. The best idea would probably be riding out to them with an armored escort, and simply approaching them, however stupid that might sound. It had worked countless times in the past. The orcs kept on advancing and were finally out of the forest. It was impressive how far these humans could see. Elves were renowned for their excellent eyesight. The fact that these humans could see that far was truly a testament to either their magic and technologies or their impressive biology. Patricia finally arrived, followed by the guard he also saw when he was meeting her. I was informed there were orcs wishing to talk to me, yet I only see soldiers, she said to the colonel. Romano nodded. According to this elf, this is the orc's way of greeting diplomats. He said, I admit it seems quite strange to me. It is strange. It's also the reason for countless wars. In my opinion, the fact they haven't changed it is idiotic. Tricurius said, However, if you don't want another war, then not shooting them down where they stand might be the best option. Sir, the orcs have halted in front of the castle's gates. A robotic voice sounded. That was one of the armored soldiers. Romano turned his head and nodded. Acknowledged. It would be illogical for them to attack a castle without any siege engines, especially when facing an unknown foe. Patricia said, Don't power armor helmets have sound amplifiers? She asked. They do. Do you want me to ask what their intentions are? Romano asked. Patricia nodded. I do, Colonel. One small problem. We don't have enough data on the Orcish language for the auto-translator to do anything with it. Romano said. You could try to speak in Elvish. It's quite a widespread language. At least one of them should be able to speak it, Tricurius suggested. Agreed, honorable diplomat. Do you perhaps have any information on the Orcish language? Patricia asked. Tricurius nodded. I brought an entire dictionary with me. I intended to study it, as I don't know the language yet. Then we'll study that after this encounter. Patricia decreed, Romano, go ahead. Romano put on his helmet. State your intentions. The sound boomed out of the helmet. Diu. The orcs seemed to look at each other in confusion until one stepped up. We come to speak, he said in poorly pronounced Elvish. Romano looked at Tricurius and Patricia. I advise against letting the entire orcish army in, he said. Patricia acknowledged his advice with a slight nodding of her head. I plan on heeding that advice. Ask them to bring a small host of soldiers and their diplomats, she said. Very well. Bring your diplomats and a small unit of guards, Romano very loudly declared. The orcs quickly started talking amidst themselves. After a few minutes, they formed 3 different groups. The first of the groups were clad in little to no armor and had to dismount their horses prior to forming the groups. In their skin were etched many tattoos. The second group wore heavy armor and had long spears alongside a round iron shield. Upon their helmets were mounted blood-red plumes. One of them carried a war banner. The third group was the smallest. It consisted out of only 50 or so men. All of them carried branches of wood that Tricurius assumed to be magical staves. They were all clad in greenish robes, and most sported thick, gray beards. I guess orcs and humans have different definitions of small, Patricia said as she watched the groups come forth. We only have room for 200 more people. That's assuming nobody else will show up. Romano said, Should I order them to form groups of 25? Patricia nodded. That would be advisable, she said. Please reform your 3 groups into groups of 25, Romano said. The soldiers next to him had taken up less aggressive positions and looked a lot less eager to kill them all than just a few minutes ago. Most of the orcs seemed to agree with Romano's idea, except the druids. The druids most likely weren't used to being commanded. They were a completely independent element of orcish society after all. They had their own leaders, rituals, and traditions. If an orc showed any magical talent, they'd be sent to the local elder druid, who would educate him from an incredibly early age. The orcs had many gods. Every tribe, city, and castle had their own god. However, there were a few which were venerated in almost every orcish settlement. There was Turgayor El, goddess of youth, the earth and farmers; Diagur, god of war, birth and death; and Gul, god of the arts, sacrifice, and perfection. There were also lesser gods, Bulbus, the sun god, Kaera, goddess of sleep, and Nakeacht, the nature god. In spite of there being many local gods, orcish religious practices were mostly consistent. The druids made sure of that. All of the major gods, and some of the minor ones, all had their own festivals and feasts. The most important of these being the Turgayor El Noria. It was the celebration of a successful harvest and involved sacrificing people to Turgayor El, the chief of the orcish pantheon and goddess of youth, earth, and farmers. The druids bickered amongst each other before, unfortunately, preparing themselves to bicker with the humans. One of the druids came forth. We demand to be let in with more people. It isn't up to you to decide how many men we are allowed to bring. The druid yelled in slightly better, albeit still horribly pronounced Elvish. Patricia sighed. This man isn't just a clown. He's the whole bloody circus. She paused briefly. Tell them that no, they don't decide how many men we feed, we house, and we allow within a human embassy, Patricia said towards Romano. Romano nodded. You are aware that if you do not comply with our demands, we are allowed to not grant you access at all. The noise boomed out loudly. The druid didn't seem content with that answer. They once again started talking amongst themselves. Another druid came forth. Tricurius strained his eyes and managed to catch a glimpse of him. He was certainly strange for an orc. His skin was browner and more elven-like than the decisively green most orcs had. His ears weren't pointed on both sides, but pointed only on one. His build was slimmer and leaner than most orcs, and his eyebrows were permanently frowning, like elven ones. A half-breed, perhaps? We agree. However, do not mistake this for our submission to your authority. The half-breed yelled in much, much better Elvish. A few minutes later, 3 groups of soldiers, one of 20, another of 21, and of course the druids with exactly 25. Romano ordered the gates to be opened with one ferocious yell towards the Emini controlling the gate. While this was going on, Patricia, Carlson, and another logistics officer were discussing how to feed these men. Although apparently food wasn't the problem, they could just ask for more. The issue was how to house them. These soldiers had some tents with them. However, how did they ensure they wouldn't raid the neighboring Emini farms, or they didn't plunder the warehouse, which was in desperate need of expansion? Thus, it was decided that Romano's battalion would be constantly patrolling the neighboring farms, as well as the castle. They also made a remark about it being strange that a colonel was leading a battalion. After Tricurius was done eavesdropping on people, he went downstairs and towards the gates. A few minutes later, Patricia, Carlson, and Romano were also gathered in front of the gate. This presented a quite interesting opportunity. He had a chance to alter humanity's first impression of the orcs. Through the gate came 3 delegates, each flanked with at least 2 guards. Many soldiers, diplomats, and druids followed them into the castle. They were met by my own knights and a few human soldiers. "Greetings, fellow diplomats," Patricia said, as she performed a low bow. "You should perform a deep bow for me," the half-breed said, as he snobbishly put his head up. "I am your better, after all." Even he himself wasn't so unapologetically arrogant and sure of his superiority when he introduced himself, Tricurius thought. Patricia responded by raising an eyebrow. "How are you my better?" she asked. "You have brought but a few hundred or thousands troops. You haven't even brought druids. Of whatever your race's equivalent is, you're either an idiot or poor," he said. He pointed towards his own entourage of druids and knights. "Me, on the other hand," he grinned, "I've brought an entire army." What gave this man an entire nation worth of confidence, Tricurius wondered. It was like he wasn't aware that the devices these soldiers were holding could pulverize any of his druids or warriors. Maybe he thought they were magical devices, and that their runes would absorb the magic, in which case he was just wrong and slightly arrogant. If he, however, thought that these humans entered a completely alien world without any plan of action or strength, he wasn't just wrong and arrogant, he was also a fool. "Doran, antagonizing yet another faction isn't what we're here to do," another orc said. Not a druid, though. The man was clad in little to no armor. Instead, he had tattoos on his head and his chest, and a thick, blood-red cloak wrapped around his shoulders. Another orc, this one clad in heavy steel armor with runes etched onto the breastplate and gauntlets, nodded his head in agreement. "If they are weaker, we will conquer them, not kill them by talking to them," he said in poorly pronounced Elvish. "By Turgayor, do you see them?" The half-breed, apparently called Doran, asked the other orcs. "They've barely figured out metallurgy with those impractical spears. Of course we're—" Doran's rant was interrupted by the heavily armored orc approaching him and punching him hard in the gut. Very hard. So hard even that Doran dropped to the floor in anguish, wallowing in pain and crying out the armored orc's name, who was named Fergoon. Within the blink of an eye, Doran stood up and conjured a flame spell in his right hand. "How dare you interrupt a druid?" he asked Fergoon. "I am Turgayor El's representative on Earth. I receive instructions from Bulbus, Diagor, and Gul." He clenched his left hand into a fist. "By punching and insulting me, you've punched and insulted them." He growled at Fergoon, who was slowly starting to back off. You insulted their worldly representative, and so you shall pay the price of this world. Patricia glanced at Romano, who in turn looked at her with worry in his face. No need to settle this with senseless violence. Your duel will only prove who is better at inflicting pain, not who is right, Patricia said. And what are you primitives going to do about it? Doran yelled at her. Patricia once again looked at Romano, who was already ready to act should it be necessary. You are subordinate to ULE laws, and according to those laws, assaulting another person on ULE territory is punishable with 1 to 10 years in prison and a fine up to 20,000, she said. This didn't disencourage Doran, who Tricurius was pretty sure was so confident in his superiority that he believed he could defeat them all. Tricurius himself now decided to intervene. Ambassador, I don't know your plan, but the armor the humans are wearing can tank your fireball with ease, and before you make the argument that you could defeat them, those instruments they're holding can blow you into 1,000,000 different pieces, Tricurius said. Imperial, you don't have the forces of the gods on your side. Your petty magic is fueled not by the divine, but by mortal and thus fallible ideas, Doran said snobbishly. Now let me deal with this fool who dared insult the messenger of the gods. Doran turned his head towards Fergoon, who in response drew his sword. Enough, Patricia yelled. Restrain him. He has repeatedly and intentionally ignored my warnings and has broken the law by threatening with death and bodily harm. I'm afraid that continuing this discussion might result in bodily harm, she said, as she gestured to Romano to order the soldiers to restrain Doran. Romano did exactly that. Doran unleashed his fireball, and it hit one of the soldiers. To my surprise, the metal didn't melt. Doran then lifted up Fergoon and telepathically smashed him into the same soldier, to little effect. Set your weapons to stun. Lethal force isn't required, Romano yelled out as he put on his helmet. Tricurius quickly cast a spell to drain some of Doran's ternitia that would weaken him for a minute or two, enough time for the soldiers to subdue him. Tricurius's plan did indeed seem to work. As the druid was trying to catch his breath, 1 out of the dozen or so soldiers fired their weapon. It hit. The druid collapsed to the ground, unconscious and subdued.